Opening lines and gaining central influence, it's a dynamic start shaping the battlefield. Instantly mirroring white's pawn establishes central control, setting the stage for an immediate contest for piece activity and an open game. Nipping the central pawn, this knight establishes a rapid threat against e5. Developing the knight here to guard the central pawn is a standard and sensible reply, preparing for kingside castling. Establishing the Lopez, this bishop threatens the knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a positional advantage. Challenging the bishop's position directly, black aims to gain space and force a decision. Retreating the bishop preserves its active post and avoids doubling black's pawns, maintaining a fluid pawn structure. Developing the knight here contests central control and prepares castling, initiating a dynamic struggle for initiative. Securing the king is paramount. This castling clears the way for central piece activity and prepares for potential pawn storms. Solidifying central influence and preparing for castling, the bishop now eyes the kingside, a crucial preparatory maneuver. Securing the center's pawn chain and opening a diagonal for the queen, this subtle repositioning readies the bishop for potential outpost defense while preparing to activate the c1 bishop later. Pushing that b-pawn aggressively fights for queenside space and forces the bishop to make another decision, potentially creating future outposts or weaknesses depending on how white responds. It's a bold statement of intent on that flank. Retreating the bishop to safety from the pawn's aggressive advance preserves its influence on the long diagonal, aiming to maintain control over key central squares and prepare for potential pawn breaks later. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to develop the bishop to a more active square, this reinforces black's central structure while simultaneously challenging white's initiative. Challenging black's queenside expansion immediately, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt the pawn structure and potentially gain central influence, though it does weaken the queenside light squares. Securing the bishop's retreat path while simultaneously preparing for a queenside pawn advance is a sensible consolidation, but it does surrender some initiative and offers white opportunities to exploit the pawn structure's slight weaknesses. Bolstering the central pawn chain and preparing a kingside pawn storm, this move quietly solidifies white's grip on key squares and prevents any immediate counterplay on the queenside, setting the stage for a nuanced positional struggle. Opening up the queenside majority, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active squares for their pieces, potentially targeting white's light-squared bishop. Consolidating the bishop's position after the long diagonal retreat, this square offers better protection and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while simultaneously surveying the central squares and awaiting further development. Challenging white's central pawn chain with a bold pawn thrust, black immediately seeks to disrupt white's harmonious development and unlock their own pieces, particularly the knight on a5, creating a dynamic pawn battle. Opening the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's queenside pawn chain and creates dynamic imbalances, forcing a decision about the central tension that has been simmering. Unleashing the queen from her relatively passive placement, QB8* endeavors to reroute her to a more active square, likely the queenside, to pressure white's advanced pawn chain or bolster potential breaks. This maneuver avoids the immediate clash on d4 and seeks to create a flexible attacking platform while simultaneously considering the safety of the queen should white's central pawns advance further. It's a positional gambit, sacrificing immediate central influence for long-term queenside pressure and queen activity. Unpinning the knight offers immediate tactical clarity, allowing development and challenging black's central grip. Challenging the encroaching bishop, black initiates a timely defensive maneuver, forcing white's hand and questioning the advanced light-squared bishop's placement. This pawn push aims to dislodge the piece, potentially creating a weakness on the now undefended a4 square if white retreats to a less active square. It's a strategic response that prioritizes piece activity and tempo, preventing white from easily consolidating their central control and offering black a chance to develop their queenside initiative. The tension created by this pawn advance, now, necessitates a decision from white regarding their attacking bishop. Sacrificing the bishop pair achieves a structural shift, clearing the way for potential pawn breaks and creating weaknesses in black's kingside pawn formation, although it does cede the bishop advantage. Reclaiming the bishop on f6 solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares to contest the crucial d-file, while also opening a diagonal for the queen towards the queenside. The pawn storm on the queenside now meets its counterpoint as the white. A pawn ventures into black territory, aiming to shatter the pawn chain and disrupt the coordination of black's pieces. This aggressive thrust might unravel the queenside structure, potentially creating weaknesses around black's king or opening lines for white's rooks and queen. Observe how this pawn sacrifice forces black to react, potentially sacrificing tempo or conceding central control in the process of defending their queenside integrity. Initiating the capture on b5 immediately opens the a-file, creating a direct assault route for your rook should it find its way there, while simultaneously dismantling white's pawn structure and potentially weakening their queenside control. This exchange, while freeing your pieces, also invites a reciprocal capture that will define the immediate tactical landscape. Seizing the open d-file after the exchange creates immediate pressure, forcing black to decide how to respond to the newfound attacking potential and potential structural weaknesses. Opening the center with this capture, black confronts the tension head-on, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and activate their queen along the now open diagonal. This advance strategically challenges white's doubled c-pawns, forcing a decision that will likely define the pawn structure for the ensuing middle game. It also unlocks the potential for the queen to participate more actively, perhaps eyeing the kingside or supporting a central pawn push. Consider how this pawn clearance influences the potential for piece play. With the d-file now open, black's rook or queen might find avenues of attack or defense through this central corridor, creating dynamic possibilities. Furthermore, this recapture signals an intent to actively contest the center rather than passively defend, potentially leading to a more tactical and open game from this point forward. White unleashes the queen, eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's monarch, particularly the potential targeting of the f7 pawn. This aggressive centralization of the queen, while seemingly active, also exposes it to potential counterplay if black can swiftly develop their pieces and organize a defense or initiate an attack on the queen side. The immediate pressure on d6 could force concessions, but white must remain acutely aware of black's developing threats and the king's safety. The queen abandons the critical d-file, surrendering the initiative to white's looming central control, while simultaneously unpinning the knight and potentially preparing to contest the c-file if white allows it. Unlocking the center and opening lines towards black's castled king is the ambitious goal behind pushing the b-pawn here, aiming to shatter the pawn structure and potentially expose weaknesses. Exploring a new path, black repositions the bishop to d7, opening the c-file for potential queen or rook activity. Disrupting the symmetry, this capture jolts the position, forcing black to confront the immediate threat to their queen and the potential for white's central pawns to advance. The immediate recapture of the pawn brings queens into confrontation, aiming to simplify the board and reduce white's central pressure. Black now has the opportunity to rearrange pieces, perhaps repositioning the knight from a5 to a more active square, and should assess if the doubled c-pawns create long-term weaknesses despite the immediate queen exchange. Clearing the central files opens a dynamic avenue for your rooks, while simultaneously resolving white's queenside pawn structure into a more defensible, if slightly isolated, c5 pawn. Initiating king activity in this slightly unusual position, black's monarch now ventures into the center, aiming to participate in the battle and perhaps exploit any lingering weaknesses on the queenside, as the pawn structure is quite fragmented. Pivoting the knight to the queenside opens a new avenue for kingside pressure, aiming to exploit the pawn structure that has developed following the pawn storm. The black monarch ventures bravely towards the center, initiating a daring centralization plan that could either unlock surprising attacking potential or leave the king fatally exposed in the ensuing skirmishes. Activating the rook on the open file provides immediate pressure and prepares to contest crucial lines, while simultaneously offering a strategic retreat for the knight should it face further threats. The rook now swings over to the open file, offering immediate pressure and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority. This maneuver skillfully exploits the long-awaited opportunity to activate the rook on the b-file, which has been partially blocked since the early exchanges. By repositioning the rook to a more active square, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create tactical possibilities. The transfer also hints at a potential endgame transition where open files become paramount, forcing white to be vigilant about defending their advanced pawns. Furthermore, this redeployment liberates the d7 bishop, potentially allowing it to support a future queenside advance or pivot to aid in the defense of the kingside. The long-term implication is a strategic contest for control of the open lines, a vital consideration given the simplified pawn structure on the queenside. Opening up the d-file for immediate pressure on black's somewhat exposed king, this maneuver seeks to activate the rook into a central role, aiming to exploit the current disorganization of black's pieces and the open lines that white has managed to create. A bold repositioning of the knight, seeking active squares and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure, though it ventures deep into enemy territory and requires careful handling to avoid isolation. Striking the knight opens the central diagonal for the white queen and forces black to make a decision about their rook on the file. This exchange simplifies the position, potentially heading towards an endgame where white's more active pieces might have an edge. Black's king currently lacks significant pawn cover and could become a target if white can coordinate their remaining pieces effectively. The pawn structure on the queenside is somewhat fragmented for black after the recent exchanges, and white will want to exploit any weaknesses. Opening up the b-file with this pawn capture is a crucial step in re-establishing black's counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially activate the rooks on the newly opened line. Liberating the rook from its passive pawn guarding duty, this exchange on the back rank aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit the newly opened files, though black's knight on c4 now presents a significant centralizing threat that must be immediately addressed. Regaining the rook is a logical and necessary recapturing maneuver, resolving the immediate material imbalance and setting the stage for a pawn-heavy endgame where black's doubled pawns on the c-file become a significant structural weakness for white to exploit. Opening the a-file now provides white a clear pathway to exert pressure on black's isolated c-pawn, potentially creating an outpost for the rook and disrupting black's pawn structure further in the endgame. The rook now ventures deep into enemy territory, eyeing the potentially weak pawns on the queenside and aiming to disrupt white's coordination. The bishop now repositions to d1, a quiet but potentially potent placement, aiming to support a future advance along the d-file or simply reposition for defense and coordination with other pieces should the game continue in a positional manner. This maneuver avoids committing the bishop to an overly aggressive square too early, allowing for flexibility and observation of black's intentions. It suggests white might be looking to reinforce their central control and prepare for a slow build-up, rather than immediately launching a direct attack. The piece's new diagonal offers a fresh perspective on the board, surveying potential weaknesses and opportunities that may arise from the current pawn structure and material balance. The black king, now an active participant, surges into the center, aiming to leverage the open files and disrupt white's remaining pieces before they can establish a cohesive defensive structure. Shifting the king to f1 aims to untangle the monarch from the immediate vicinity of the passed pawn and potentially bring it into play on the kingside, a subtle but often crucial repositioning in unbalanced positions where material is equal but pawn structure is fractured. Reclaiming the bishop to g4 sharpens black's influence on the central squares, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and potential pawn weaknesses. The rook's advance offers a vital check, forcing the black king to a more exposed square and potentially opening lines for further penetration. The black monarch bravely ventures into the heart of the action, a risky maneuver that offers potential dynamism, but exposes it to numerous threats along the open lines and diagonals. Seizing the open file and forcing the black king into a more exposed position, this maneuver aims to exploit the currently loose coordination of black's pieces and create immediate pressure. Seeking a safe haven, the black king scurries from the immediate pressure of the rook, a necessary retreat to consolidate and prepare for the looming material imbalance that white's centralized pieces will soon exploit. Opening the h-file now with the rook is a proactive step, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially create a mating net. Bringing the bishop back to d7 now aims to bolster the pawn chain and offer a potential escape square for the king, while simultaneously eyeing the now open c-file for future activity or defense. Securing the open file, the rook now begins its methodical march to dominate the file, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the back rank should further opportunities arise. Solidifying the bishop's position on c6 aims to disrupt white's control of the c-file and potentially prepare for a later advance of the c-pawn, while simultaneously providing a safe haven for the bishop away from immediate threats and offering a new attacking angle on white's queenside. Safeguarding the king from immediate checks is paramount, and relocating the bishop to a more active diagonal opens up potential counterplay against black's centralized pawns. Unleashing the bishop to a commanding diagonal, this piece now aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially prepare for an advance on the queenside, creating crucial counterplay while preventing any easy consolidation for the opponent. Recalibrating piece placement, the bishop steps back to d1, seeking a safer post and preparing to contest the critical central files should they open further. Relocating the king to b6 offers a sanctuary from the immediate rook threat on the file, while simultaneously preparing to potentially contest the d-file once the bishop retreats, a subtle shift towards centralizing the monarch in this complex, unbalanced middle game. Shifting the king to e1 is a logical step to activate it in this endgame, preparing to support the central pawns and potentially join the fight on the kingside if the opportunity arises, while also preventing any sneaky checks from the bishop. Refuge for the bishop, seeking safer pastures away from the aggressive knight's patrol and potentially solidifying the central pawn structure's integrity. A patient repositioning of the bishop aims to improve its defensive posture and prepare for potential future advances on the kingside, while keeping a watchful eye on black's central pawn majority. Activating the rook on the half-open c-file, this piece immediately eyes the vulnerable white king and aims to create threats against its defenses. Seizing the opportunity, white boldly advances a knight into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats against the exposed monarch, leveraging the open lines established earlier in the game. The bishop retreats to f6, a sensible repositioning to defend the d6 pawn and prepare for further defensive maneuvers against white's encroaching pieces. A forceful capture, this knight's advance immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and opens lines towards their king. The black king ventures deep into enemy territory, a bold gamble to activate the monarch, but it leaves it exposed to white's approaching forces on the open c-file. Seizing the open file with the rook forces the opposing bishop to defend the pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses around black's king. Seizing the opportunity presented by the exposed white king, black introduces a forcing sequence designed to disrupt white's coordination and potentially win material. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as the king retreats to the relative safety of the first rank, aiming to escape the immediate tactical crossfire. Sacrificing the rook here allows black to finally activate their beleaguered king and potentially escape the oppressive pressure white has been building on the kingside, though it does surrender significant material. The monarch ventures out, a bold gambit embracing the chaos of an open board, hoping to leverage its newfound activity before black's rook and bishops can fully assert their dominance on this exposed diagonal. A brilliant counterattack emerges from the seemingly passive rook sacrifice, directly targeting the recently crowned monarch's unsafe location. King's safety is paramount, and bringing your monarch into the fray now invites a barrage of checks, potentially creating a mating net. The black king, having ventured far from its protective pawn shield, now finds itself in a perilous situation, demanding immediate attention to ensure its survival. Fortifying the king's protection becomes paramount as the battle shifts towards the endgame. a solidifying maneuver for the king's sanctuary, preparing for potential advances or defensive adjustments. The bishop finds a more active post, eyeing the queenside pawns and preparing to join the central struggle should the opportunity arise. Shifting the monarch to the second rank provides a crucial escape square, safeguarding against potential checks from the adversary's bishop and queen on the diagonal, while also preparing to support a potential g-pawn push to further solidify the king's shelter and advance the pawn structure. Bringing the king closer to the action is a sensible decision. After all, the central pawns are now a significant target, and active king participation is paramount in this simplified structure to defend them and potentially create counterplay. Solidifying the pawn structure in front of the king and preparing for a potential advance of the kingside pawns offers a much-needed defensive stability. Shifting the pawn to g5 aims to disrupt white's entrenched pieces and create an attacking pawn mass, potentially opening lines toward the white king or gaining space on the kingside. Opening up the long diagonal for the rook might be intended to pressure the black pawns, but it also exposes the white king to potential checks if black can bring forces to bear on the g-file. Unleashing the bishop from its passive guard position allows it to participate more actively, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open diagonals for further attack. Aggressively seizing the open file disrupts black's consolidation, forcing them to react to immediate threats and potentially exposing their king's safety further. This maneuver aims to contest the dark squares and prevent white's rook from finding an easy route back into the game along the 7th rank, a crucial defensive and offensive consideration in this endgame. Securing the rook on the 2nd rank with the intention of initiating a pawn push in the center, perhaps f3 followed by g4, aims to create a passed pawn and exploit the somewhat exposed black king. The king bravely ventures into enemy territory, seeking out weaknesses in white's pawn structure while hoping for friendly support to materialize. Securing the king's perimeter becomes paramount now, ensuring it's shielded from any potential discovered attacks or pawn pushes that could expose it. Pushing the h-pawn signals a clear intent to expand on the kingside, aiming to create counterplay and potentially disturb the harmony of white's pieces after their recent repositioning. Challenging the pawn chain directly, attempting to pry open lines towards the enemy king. The bishop now aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses and offering an escape square for the rook. Bringing the rook back to the 1st rank solidifies control of that crucial open file, ready to support any potential advance or counter a black initiative on the queen side. Unleashing pawns across the board often signifies a player's intent to create dynamic counterplay, even if it means sacrificing some positional solidity in the process. Gaining space on the kingside with that pawn push aims to restrict black's bishop and potentially open lines for the rook, though it also creates a potential weakness on e4 if black can exploit it. Focusing on activating the bishop on d3 now creates a tactical nexus, potentially pinning the knight on e5 and allowing the king to escape to the safety of the kingside after castling. Unlocking the kingside with a pawn thrust, offering a critical outpost for the knight. Disrupting the enemy's cohesive pawn structure with a well-timed check is a classic maneuver, forcing white's king into a more exposed position and potentially setting up future pawn breaks for black. The king, now exposed on the flank, seeks refuge behind the pawns, a desperate attempt to find safety amidst the growing tactical complexity. The monarch ventures out, seeking sanctuary amidst the enemy ranks, a bold gambit aiming to exploit the currently uncoordinated white pieces before they can establish a more cohesive defense. The rook vacates the 7th rank, opening a potential escape route for the king and preparing to challenge black's pawn structure from a new angle. The bishop, now freed from its pawn guard, repositions to eye the weak g2 pawn, a subtle but crucial repositioning aiming to create complications and perhaps snag a pawn. Forcing the black king to choose its square, this check aims to dislodge the opponent's monarch and exploit the exposed position created by the recent pawn advances. King hunts are often decided by precise pawn advances, and this recent king shuffle is no exception, aiming to either secure a safe haven on the second rank or potentially create a passed pawn down the file if white is forced to defend. Harnessing the freed-up rook, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pieces and potentially establish a new outpost for white's king. The black king, having enjoyed its wanderings, now faces a crucial decision: consolidate its position or continue its adventurous exploration amidst white's increasingly organized forces. The opposition shifts dramatically as white checks, forcing the black king to relinquish its comfortable square and potentially exposing it to further harassment in the coming exchanges. Sensing a draw is imminent through repetition, black forces white's hand by placing the king in a position where it must move to avoid the same square sequence. The rook's repositioning to the b-file aims to exploit the open nature of the rank and potentially create passed pawns or offer support for a central pawn push, while also keeping an eye on any potential counterplay along the 7th rank should black's king venture too far. The repeated king shuffle on the 2nd rank clearly signals a desire to escape the ongoing pawn storm and seek safety in the corner, a desperate attempt to consolidate a precarious position. The white king, now actively seeking sanctuary on the queen side, hopes to escape further harassment and perhaps find some breathing room amidst the scattered pawns. Hoping to outwit the opponent's pawn chain, black's bishop now tucks away, setting up potential infiltration or defensive support on the king side as the game grinds towards a pawn-heavy conclusion. Securing the rook's position on the 4th rank offers a breathing space, allowing white to regroup and consider how to exploit the open lines and the slight pawn weakness on the king side that black's aggressive pawn push has created. A curious retreat of the bishop, abandoning the previously established control over the c4 square and re-entering a passive defense of the king side, which seems rather belated given the advanced state of white's pawn storm. Bolstering the pawn chain on the queen side creates a more resilient structure against black's active pieces, preparing for a potential expansion or defense on that flank. Black's king, having ventured far from its starting sanctuary, now faces the daunting task of navigating the exposed center, a precarious journey indeed. Repositioning the rook to the 3rd rank now cramps black's bishop and prepares for a potential pawn push, aiming to restrict black's mobility and perhaps initiate a queenside advance. The black king, having ventured into enemy territory, now finds itself the object of a very deliberate harassment campaign. Forcing its retreat again seems like a reasonable goal, but it also risks falling into a perpetual chase, which might actually be to white's disadvantage if black can use the time to shore up their position. Forcing the black king back into a more confined space, this check reasserts white's spatial advantage and prepares to regroup the rook for potential pawn pressure. The black king makes a bold dash to f1, abandoning its relative safety on e3 and venturing into a potentially exposed position.